It was another morning in the small town of Kingswood. The sun had just begun its climb, casting long shadows across the streets. The local coffee shop was buzzing with the usual crowd, mostly white, mostly well-to-do. Nothing out of the ordinary. He had been in this town for a few months now, working as a graphic designer for a local advertising firm. The work was steady, and his apartment was just a few blocks away. He wasn't a stranger here, but he didn't feel truly seen either. As he waited for his coffee, he caught the briefest of glances from a few patrons. They didn't stare outright, but Marcus knew the look, the subtle flick of the eyes, the slight hesitation before they turned back to their drinks. It was the same everywhere he went, the feeling that, even in a crowd, you weren't quite welcome. "Marcus!" He smiled and walked up to the counter, but as he reached for the cup, he saw it, a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. She hesitated for just a second too long. "Here you go," she said, handing him the cup a little too quickly, her hand brushing his just a bit too stiffly. Marcus took the cup without a word, but his mind was already racing. Was it just his imagination? Was he reading into things? Or was he just used to the feeling that people like him didn't quite fit in? He turned away from the counter and made his way to the door. He tried to shake it off.
The barista, a young white woman with tattoos, called out his name when his order was ready. He smiled and walked up to the counter, but as he reached for the cup, he saw it, a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. She hesitated for just a second too long. "Here you go," she said, handing him the cup a little too quickly, her hand brushing his just a bit too stiffly. Marcus took the cup without a word, but his mind was already racing. Was it just his imagination? Was he reading into things? Or was he just used to the feeling that people like him didn't quite fit in? He turned away from the counter and made his way to the door. He tried to shake it off, but then it happened. As he stepped out of the coffee shop, a police car rolled slowly past him. The window rolled down, and a voice called out from inside. "Hey, you," the officer said, his tone casual but firm. "What are you doing here?" Marcus froze. The officer was young, maybe in his early 30s, white, with a crew cut. "Just grabbing coffee," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the shock that hit him. The officer looked him up and down, his gaze lingering just a little too long. "Where are you coming from?" Marcus's stomach sank. Was this really happening? "I live down the block," he said, trying to keep it casual like any other person would. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stared at Marcus for a moment, eyes narrow. Then he leaned over to his partner in the passenger seat, said something under his breath, and looked back at Marcus. "All right," the officer said after a long pause. "Just make sure you're not loitering around here too long." He didn't wait for a response before rolling the window up and driving off. Marcus stood there, stunned. Loitering? He hadn't done anything but grab a coffee. He tried to shake it off, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment staring at the city lights through his window. He couldn't stop thinking about the interaction with the cop. He'd been stopped by police before, but this time felt different. The unease in the officer's eyes, the way his partner hadn't even bothered to look at him, the way they'd treated him like he was out of place in a town he'd been living in for months. It wasn't just the stop. It was the way it felt like everyone was watching him, even when they weren't. It was the knowing that no matter how hard he worked, how well he behaved, there were invisible walls he couldn't break through, and no one had to say a word to make him feel it.
The next morning, Marcus tried to put the whole thing behind him. He had a meeting with a client about a new ad campaign, and he needed to focus. But as soon as he stepped into the office building, the weight of the world seemed to come down on him again. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with glasses, didn't look up from her desk when he entered. He cleared his throat, but she didn't seem to notice. It wasn't until he walked up to the counter that she finally looked at him, her eyes widening just a little bit. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice thin, almost hesitant. "I'm here for a meeting with Mrs. Harris," Marcus replied, keeping his tone friendly. The receptionist blinked a few times, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. Your name?" she asked. "Marcus Carter," he said, wondering if she'd even bothered to check the visitor list. There was a long pause before she nodded and motioned to the seating area. "Just have a seat. Mrs. Harris will be with you shortly." Marcus sat down, the familiar weight of being the only one in the room pressing on him again. As the minutes ticked by, he tried not to let his mind wander back to the encounter with the officer. But it wasn't just the cop. It was everywhere. The way people looked at him when he walked into a room. The way he was always a little too aware of the space he occupied. How he had to prove he belonged every time he stepped outside. Then Mrs. Harris, the client he was supposed to be meeting with, walked into the lobby. She was an older woman, gray-haired, wearing a conservative outfit. She didn't look at Marcus when she first entered. She walked right past him, nodding at the receptionist, before finally stopping to greet him. "Mr. Carter?" she said, her smile tight. "Yes, that's me," he said, standing up, extending his hand. She shook his hand quickly, before leading him down the hall to her office. They exchanged pleasantries, but it felt forced. As they sat down, Marcus tried to ignore the subtle differences in the way she treated him compared to her other clients. The way her eyes flicked to his skin, then quickly looked away, the quick, almost nervous gestures. "Let's get down to business," Mrs. Harris said. "I've seen your portfolio and I think you've got potential, but—" She paused, then glanced at him again. "I just want to make sure you understand our brand. You know, it's not just about making things look pretty. We need something that will appeal to our target audience." Marcus nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I understand completely. I've done a lot of research on your brand, and I think I've come up with some concepts that will work perfectly for your demographic." But all he could hear in the back of his mind was her unspoken message. "Are you really cut out for this?" The doubt was thick in the air. He had been given the job based on his talent, not his race. Or so he'd thought. But now the cracks in the illusion were starting to show. As the meeting continued, Marcus found it harder and harder to focus. The questions were coming faster now, all under the guise of making sure we're on the same page. He could feel the discomfort in Mrs. Harris's tone, the way she kept shifting in her seat. But it wasn't just her. It was the whole room. The air was charged with tension. When the meeting ended, Mrs. Harris offered a tight smile and a handshake. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Carter," she said. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. As he walked out of the office, he realized that this wasn't just a bad day. This was the weight of the system he was working within. It wasn't about one interaction, one misunderstanding. It was about the hundreds of little moments like these that slowly wore you down. He walked out of the building, feeling that same old pressure pressing down on his chest. It wasn't new. He was used to it. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. That night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, the city lights stretching out before him. He thought about the look in Mrs. Harris's eyes, the hesitation, the doubt. He thought about the police officer, about the way his presence was never quite welcomed, never quite accepted. And in that moment, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let them define him. He wasn't going to let their assumptions dictate his future. But it wasn't enough just to say it. He was going to fight back, in the only way he knew how, through his work, through his voice, and by pushing back against the walls that were built to keep him out. It wouldn't be easy, and it might never be over, but it was the fight he had no choice but to take on. The next day he walked into the coffee shop again, his head held higher, his shoulders squared. This time he didn't look at the people who glanced at him. This time he didn't care. He was just a man with a life to live and a future to create. He wasn't invisible, and he wasn't going anywhere. The walls may have been built, but Marcus was done being defined by them. He was going to break them down. The days that followed felt like a constant battle between staying composed and the rage that was bubbling just under the surface. Marcus continued to work, continued to show up, but each interaction, each look, was a reminder that he wasn't playing on a level field. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back. And yet, he kept going. He couldn't afford not to. The incident with the police officer was far from over. The whispers in the community were just starting to gain momentum. People who had seen him, heard him speak, or even glanced at him as he walked into a store were starting to ask questions. And those questions weren't just about Marcus anymore. They were about the system that had allowed this to happen. In the break room at work, his coworkers started talking. At first it was subtle. The kind of passive-aggressive comment meant to make you second-guess everything. "I can't believe people still deal with that kind of stuff, right?" one of them said, looking up from their phone. "It's 2025. Marcus didn't respond right away. He couldn't. He had learned a long time ago that people didn't want to hear the truth. They didn't want to see it. They wanted to be comfortable with the world they lived in. He could feel the weight of that conversation looming over him. But that day he couldn't stay silent. He had reached his limit. "I'm tired of hearing that," Marcus said, his voice steady but cutting through the air like a knife. "You think it's just a thing that happens? That it's just some isolated incident? No, it's not. It's the way it works. Every single day." The room went quiet. His coworkers stared at him, but they didn't know how to respond. "Every time I walk into a room, I have to convince people I belong. Every time I go into a store, I wonder if I'm going to be stopped. Every time I get pulled over, I wonder if I'm going to make it home alive. You think that's a thing?" Marcus continued, his words sharp, his anger boiling over. "That's my reality. That's my life." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was suffocating. For the first time, Marcus felt like he had said the things he had been holding in for years. He didn't feel the need to explain anymore. He was tired of explaining. The truth had been laid bare, and they could either accept it or ignore it. The next day, the atmosphere at work was different. The tension in the air had shifted. The comments weren't as passive now. People started avoiding his gaze or looking at him with pity in their eyes, but they didn't dare approach him again. Marcus wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't looking for anyone to apologize. He was just tired of pretending that everything was okay. And then, out of nowhere, he received an email. It was from Mrs. Harris, the client he had met with the other day. "I've been thinking a lot about our meeting," the email read. "I want to be clear about something. The way I treated you wasn't right. I see now that I made assumptions based on how you look, and I want to apologize for that. If you're still interested, I'd like to offer you a chance to redesign our brand's image, something fresh, something that speaks to everyone. You've got the vision, and I'd like to give you a shot." Marcus stared at the email for a long time. Was it real? Was she just trying to make up for the awkwardness of their last meeting? Or was she actually sincere? He stared at the screen and typed back, "I'll consider your offer. But let's make something clear. It's not just about design, it's about vision. If we're going to do this, we need to address what's behind the curtain, the assumptions, the biases, the things people don't see. Let's start there. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. This was the conversation he had been waiting for, the conversation he had to have, the one that wouldn't just change his career, but would force the world around him to look at things differently. The meeting with Mrs. Harris was set for the following week. She was punctual, but there was something different about her. She wasn't wearing her usual business suit. Instead, she wore a plain blouse and slacks, looking almost vulnerable. Marcus sat down with her. "I've been reading about systemic racism," she said, her voice tight, like the words were new to her. "I didn't get it before, but now I'm seeing it everywhere. It's like I've been blind, and I don't know how to undo it." "That's the hardest part," Marcus replied. "People don't see it because they don't have to. They don't question what they don't experience. But it's there. It's always been there." Her eyes met his. "So, where do we start?" "We start by being honest," he said. "We say that the way things have been done isn't working. And we start by listening, really listening, to the voices that have been silenced." She nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. As the meeting went on, they began to talk about the redesign. They didn't just discuss the visuals of the brand. They talked about inclusivity, about representation, about the way advertisements had always been built with one audience in mind, people who didn't look like him. They started talking about how to make sure that every voice, every person, was included in the conversation. It wasn't just about a logo anymore. It was about making a statement, a real, tangible change. When the meeting ended, Marcus stood up and extended his hand to Mrs. Harris. "This is a start," he said, his voice firm. She shook his hand, this time without hesitation, her gaze steady and full of purpose. "I know, but I'm willing to try." As Marcus left the building, he couldn't help but feel a shift within himself. Maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to listen. The world was ready for change, and he wasn't going to stop fighting for it, one step, one conversation, one design at a time. Weeks passed. The new brand launched, and it wasn't just another product line, it was a declaration. The feedback was overwhelming, but not just because it was different or innovative. People saw themselves in it. People felt seen. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt like he wasn't invisible. It wasn't just the work that had changed. It was the way he saw the world. He wasn't just trying to fit in anymore. He was demanding his space, his voice, and the respect that should have been there all along. One evening he went for a walk down the same street where he'd been stopped by the police officer weeks ago. This time, as he passed the coffee shop, no one looked at him like he was out of place. No one eyed him suspiciously. He walked in, ordered his coffee, and when he stepped out, he felt like he belonged. No need to prove anything. That was his victory. The days that followed felt like a weight had been lifted, but there was still an undercurrent of tension. People around him, even those he worked with, started approaching him with a kind of cautious respect. It was like they were waiting for him to say something, waiting for a cue on how they should behave, how they should interact. Marcus didn't know if he was supposed to educate them or just keep moving forward. The whole thing felt strange. During a routine client meeting, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Harris seemed different too. Her openness to learning more about the struggles of marginalized communities wasn't something he'd anticipated, and neither was the change it brought to the way she spoke about her brand. "I've been thinking about what we discussed, Marcus, and it's not just about advertising. It's about how we, as a company, contribute to the bigger picture, how we shape perceptions. What kind of message do we want to send to the world? She asked, her voice steady. Marcus leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he processed her words. It's about dismantling the assumptions, he said slowly. You want people to see something real. You want them to see each other as people, not as labels. That's the only way we'll really change anything. Mrs. Harris nodded. I've been researching diversity and inclusivity, and it's been an eye-opener. I always thought we were doing enough, but now I see the gap. She paused. I want to do more. What do you think? Marcus didn't know what to say. It was unexpected, this shift. To hear someone, especially someone in her position, speak so openly about being wrong, about trying to make a change. But the truth was, the company had power. Their reach was vast. And if they started shifting how they did business, if they started actually changing how they approached their audience, it could have a ripple effect. I think you're on the right path, Marcus said finally. But it's more than just a conversation. It's action. You need to embed these values into your work culture, into your hiring practices, into how you engage with your clients. This has to be part of your identity, not just a marketing campaign. There was a silence between them as Mrs. Harris absorbed the weight of his words. She wasn't asking for an easy solution, and he respected that. It wasn't going to be fast. It wasn't going to be perfect. But it was a step in the right direction. In the days that followed, they worked on rebranding the company with a new focus on inclusivity. It wasn't just about diversity for the sake of optics. It was about real change, about changing the narrative. The marketing team dove deep into research on racial bias, microaggressions, and cultural representation. They didn't want to simply reflect an idealized image of diversity. They wanted to challenge the stereotypes and present a more honest, more diverse reality. The response from their clients was mixed. Some loved the new direction, the boldness of it. Others were more hesitant, unsure of how it would be received by their core audience. But it didn't matter. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he was part of something that actually mattered. But there were still moments when he caught himself wondering if it was enough. The subtle glances from strangers, the awkwardness at work, the feeling that no matter how much progress was made, there was always someone waiting for him to slip up, to be the exception to the rule. It was exhausting, that constant reminder that society had a box for him, and no matter how much he proved himself, that box wouldn't ever quite go away. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, reviewing the new campaign designs, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his brother. "How you doing, bro?" Marcus smiled to himself and typed back, "Better than ever." His brother had no idea how much that simple text meant. It wasn't about the big things anymore. It was about the quiet moments, the small victories that didn't get headlines, the subtle shifts that no one else noticed, but were slowly, gradually, making a difference. A few weeks later, Marcus was walking through the same coffee shop where he'd been stopped by the police officer. He didn't expect anything to be different. But as he stepped inside, he noticed something strange. The barista, the same woman who had once handed him his coffee with that uncomfortable tension, now smiled at him warmly as he walked up to the counter. "Good morning, Marcus," she said, her tone friendly and genuine. For a second, Marcus hesitated, but then he smiled back. "Good morning," he replied, taking his coffee without that familiar weight in his chest. It wasn't just the coffee. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were beginning to shift in ways he hadn't even realized. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fast, but it was progress.
and it was worth fighting for. As he walked out of the shop, he felt a sense of quiet pride. He wasn't just trying to fit in anymore. He was carving out space for himself, for his voice, for his presence. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to prove a damn thing. The world was beginning to see him, and that was enough.